to Where Are They Now? We reach into the archives of Lenape, Shawnee, Cherokee, and Seneca High Schools and invite selected alumni to share memories and fill us in on their career paths after commencement. Since Lenape's first graduating class in 1961, Shawnee's in 1972, Cherokee's in 1978, and Seneca's in 2005, over 65,000 individuals have received diplomas from these four schools. Here now is your host, DJ Deeney.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Where Are They Now? Today we will be reconnecting with an alum from Lenape's class of 1973, Susan Monday. Susan is a talk show host for Delaware 105.9 FM News Talk Radio and lives in Milton, Delaware. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. We want to take you back through your high school journey and then kind of see what you're up to now. Going back to Lenape in the early 70s, you had a bunch of activities you participated in. Some of them that you wrote down for us. You were in the Student Council, the National Honor Society, German Club. You were the recording secretary, and you also did cheerleading. It was a big part of your life as far as academically and extracurricularly your high school years.
Yeah.
You had some special teachers and faculty that you remember fondly. Mrs. Mannion, what do you remember about Mrs. Mannion?
Well, as you know from my biography, I was an English major, and she really was very formative in helping me focus on that. I had her for 2 years, actually, and she fostered in me, I had already loved to read books, but she fostered in me a great love of literature and also helped me become a creative writer.
Now, you noted a specific instance that kind of boosted your confidence. What was that all about?
Yes, we were in the poetry section, and we were assigned to write a poem. And I wrote the poem and submitted it, and when I got it back from Mrs. Mannion, she wrote on there in red marker, "Did I write this?" And I was like, I knew it was a compliment because she was basically kind of accusing me of plagiarizing it. And yes, I did write it, and that really did boost my confidence because I knew that it was a good poem.
Tell me about Mr. Lascalzo.
Well, I'm not a big science person, but I had him for freshman science, general science. I don't know if they still offer that at Lenape. And he made science so fun that I finally got it. I had gone to Catholic school prior to enrolling at Lenape, and they did not focus very much on science. And so I was weak in that department, strong in grammar, strong in reading, but not so strong in science. And Mr. Lascalzo was such a fun teacher that he made me really understand science for the first time in my life.
So he made a subject you wouldn't normally appreciate a little bit more appreciate, though.
Yes, absolutely.
How about Mr. Bukoffer?
Well, back in the day, and again, I don't know what the requirements are these days for Lenape students, but we were required to take, I think, 2 years of a language. And for some reason, I chose German. And he was my German teacher my senior year in high school. And he took us all on a trip to Germany. And we had some really fun times in Germany. I can remember a lot of that trip. I worked at Woolworths at the Morristown Mall to save my money. And this just kind of gives you an idea of how much things cost back in the 70s. That trip only cost $400. At the time, that was a lot of money for a 17-year-old girl, but I raised that money by working at Woolworth and had a wonderful trip. But the thing that I remember the most was it was the first time I had ever flown. And imagine this, flying overseas, and we flew into a snowstorm, and I remember that because it was really scary.
You have this established high school career. Did you always know when you were there that you wanted to do something with English at the time?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a teacher, but also in the back of my mind, I really, really wanted to be in radio. Really, I did. And in fact, back in the day, I volunteered to do the morning announcements. So, you know, that was in the 70s. We didn't have the technology that you have today. And so I guess my first foray into being in radio or being an announcer was to do the morning announcements over the PA system at Lenape High School. So even more than doing something with English, always in the back of my mind, I wanted to do something with radio. Because I grew up in when FM radio was first starting to come into fruition. You probably can't really relate to that, but when I was growing up, it was AM radio all the way. And when FM radio started, it was like, oh, what is FM radio? And because we lived so close to Philadelphia, WMMR was the station that was the coolest station ever. And so I had always in the back of my mind that I wanted to do that kind of thing for a living. But what I did end up doing was go to college to become an English teacher.
Okay, so before we get you to college, let's talk a little bit more about high school. Some of the special friendships that you made in high school. You want to talk about some of those?
Sure. I am still very close to a couple of people that I went to high school with, and I'll name them. One of them is Joe Perone, very good friend of mine. And a funny story, I don't know if he told it, but I fixed him up with Marie Scoron, and Joe Perone ended up marrying her. And it all came about because he asked me to the prom.
Because you turned him down. Yeah.
And then that night, we all went out to dinner, and I invited my friend, Marie Scoron, and he ended up marrying her. The other person that I'm very close to is former student Barbara Palladino. So what's been great is that I'm still friends with people that I went to high school with.
And you mentioned a couple students that you were close with that have passed away?
Well, my closest friend growing up, I grew up in Ramblewood in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. My closest friend is a girl by the name of Mary Ellen Konishek. She graduated the same year that we did, and we were childhood friends. And yes, she did pass away when she was 46. So she was really my closest friend.
And Craig Powers as well, you mentioned.
Yeah, he passed away, I can't remember, probably in the last 10 years. But I remember him because he was new to the area. He had moved into Mount Laurel, and he didn't have a lot of friends. And I remember, it's funny, I went through some of my yearbooks, and one of the things he had written in my yearbook freshman year was he thanked me for befriending him because he didn't know a lot of people. And I remember, this is just a crazy memory, I loved Tasty Cake peach pies, and he would always buy me one in the school cafeteria and give it to me at lunchtime. So I think he liked me too.
All right, well, so you finish up high school. Obviously you decided you wanted to do something the English route, even though you did have this aspiration to be a star on the radio or on television. You ended up at University of Delaware. What went into that decision?
Well, what went into that decision was that it was fairly inexpensive to go there. And since I was paying for most of my college, I applied to a bunch of different schools. Douglas College, which is and I don't even know anymore, it was the all-female division of Rutgers. I don't think they have that anymore. So I applied there. I applied to a couple other places, got into all of them, but I chose to go to the University of Delaware. One, because it was far enough away from home, but close enough to home. And the other factor that went into it, quite honestly, was that it was not that expensive. I remember, I thought $3,500 a year was pretty expensive back in the day, but you know, it's relative compared to what kids today pay to go to college.
Yeah, I think that's like what you spend at the bookstore now for the first
Yeah,
semester.
right, exactly.
So you end up at University of Delaware. Any specific memories from when you were in college that you could take away?
Yeah, I do. Remember one day, this kind of links back to my wanting to be in radio. I remember going down to the radio station at the Student Center at the university, and I wanted to go in there and see if I could start working there, volunteering there, interning there, whatever. And I didn't have the courage, for some reason, to knock on the door and go in there. And so I continued on my journey as an English major. But that's the thing that was always in the back of like a little voice in the back of my head saying, you need to do this, you need to do this. And we'll talk about it later when I finally did do it. But I distinctly remember going to the radio station because it was in the basement of the student center, and not having the courage to go in there. And I'm not sure why, but if you think about this, growing up in the 70s, you know, women kind of went into more traditional roles, and that was a teacher, a nurse, those sorts of things. And going into something like radio, which really male-dominated world, especially in the 70s, was, I guess, what kind of created that caution in me.
Now, what year of college did you have this event that you?
I was probably, it was probably like my sophomore year, where I went there and then just couldn't do it or didn't do it.
So then you didn't go, and the next 2 years you continued studying and graduated with your bachelor's for English, correct?
Right, English education.
So then what happened out of college, your first job?
Well, and I will say this about the University of Delaware. They have a fabulous career placement center that helps you find a job. And so I interviewed with a couple of school systems and got a job, accepted a job in a rural county in Maryland. And a few weeks after that, the Baltimore County Public School System called me, and I knew that I really, having grown up in South Jersey, both my parents are from Philadelphia, I knew that I wanted to be in more of a city environment. So I turned down the other job and took the job with Baltimore County Public Schools, and I started in 1977 as a high school English teacher.
And how long were you there?
I was there for 8 years.
Okay, so then take us through, I guess, kind of the itch or that voice in your head that you said, got us to where we are now through this first job.
It's funny you say that, because people that knew me from when I was a teacher always have said to me that I would talk about the fact that I wanted to be in radio or TV. So even while I was teaching, I was saying, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do. But you know how life is, and I didn't do it right away. So I left teaching, and I got into the field of training and development, and I went back to school and got my master's degree in adult education. And so for, like 15 years or so, I worked in the field. I worked in corporate America in the field of training and development. And it wasn't particularly satisfying. And I made a lot of money, which is a good thing, because I saved a lot of money. And when the time came for me to make that leap, and I was much older at that time, to make the leap into radio, I could afford to take a lower salary because I had made money working in the corporate world.
So you get the master's at Johns Hopkins, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then you move on, you said 15 years about before you?
Yeah, I think 15 years. I worked for a bunch of different corporations. I worked for PNC Bank in Philadelphia. I worked for Ryland Homes. I was living in Maryland. I worked for Joseph Bank Clothers. So I think I had about 3 jobs working in the field of training and development, like as a director of training. And it made sense because I had been a teacher and now I was a trainer. Same kind of thing, only working with adults and teaching different subject matter. But my heart was never in it.
So, but all along the way, you said you're putting away money, you're saving, and you're still having that itch, that voice in your head that says, let's go do this. So take us to that point now where that moment finally comes where you're like, okay, I'm doing it.
So I ran into a former student of mine that I had taught in Baltimore County Public Schools. And I was working a full-time job, as I said, in corporate America. And that student, coincidentally, was the program director of a very small radio station in southern Delaware. And I think that meeting was very fortuitous because he was my former student, I was his former teacher, and I said to him, hey, can I do some work at your radio station? It was a classic rock radio station. And he said, sure, because it was a small radio station. I had no experience. And when you work in a small market, you can make mistakes. And so I started working on the weekends at this very, very small radio station. And boy, did I ever make a lot of mistakes. So I still had my full-time job, and I was working like Saturdays, doing a classic rock radio show. And I remember one day, I mean, I was screwed up so much because I just did not know what I was doing. And I remember one day the owner of the station called me and said, he said, what do you think, yelled at me essentially. He said, what do you think this is, college radio? And I thought, okay, I know I've got to get better here when he said that.
For you, it was pretty much, though.
It was college radio. You're right. You're right, yeah.
So it got better, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, so I continued to work in corporate America and worked part-time in radio because, you know, when you work part-time back then, I don't know when it was probably the early 90s. Whatever minimum wage was at that time, I was making minimum wage, so I wasn't about to give up my full-time job for a job making minimum wage. So I worked at a couple places part-time, and the last place that I worked part-time was a station in Wilmington, Delaware, called WDEL WSTW. And by that time, I had moved back to the Philadelphia area, and I was working for PNC Bank. So all along, you can kind of see what I'm doing, keeping the job where I'm making big bucks, and then working these little part-time jobs in radio, making no money, and I wasn't really doing it for the money. I was trying to get experience. And so I was working for this station in Wilmington, I was a jack of all trades, honestly, and that was really a good opportunity for me because I learned so many different things. I worked at the music station, and I worked at the news talk station, doing all kinds of things behind the scenes, learning how to run the equipment, that sort of thing. And then one day, it was the news director at WGEL, must have thought, because I had been an English teacher, oh, well, maybe this person can write. He was right about that. And maybe this person can speak clearly and articulate on the air. He was right about that. So they asked me to start doing some work on the news station. And I wasn't really all that interested because my heart was in music, and more particularly classic rock. But by the time the 90s had come around, the radio business had really changed. So keep in mind something I said earlier. When I was growing up in the 70s, a teenager in the 70s, when I was going to Lenape High School, FM radio was just coming into being. And a guy that is still on WMMR, Pierre Robert, was extremely influential in my life, because back in those days in the 70s, you could put a whole side of an album on and talk about it. That doesn't happen today. So by the time the 90s rolled around, radio had become, very commercialized. And you had to play what you were told to play, unlike in the 70s and unlike in the 80s. And so I kind of lost interest in the music side of radio, because I wanted to get on the radio and play whatever I wanted to play.
At this point, you were getting told by a program director what songs are being played, as opposed to,
yeah,
hey, I want to play this.
Right. It was so programmed, and it left very little opportunity to, be yourself. And so when they asked me to start doing news, I'm like, okay, what the heck, I'll do it. And I started doing it. It was okay. And then I did it for about a year part-time. And then they asked me because someone had left the station, if I wanted to be the co-host of the morning show. I'm like, okay. So I was just kind of rolling with the punches at this point. And that was a full-time job.
Were you still working full-time at your other job when they asked you to do this? Okay.
Yes, I was still working full-time, socking away money, and they asked me if I wanted to be the co-host. And I said yes. And honestly, it was a dramatic drop in salary. Most people wouldn't have done it, because at this point in my life, I think I was like 39 years old, on the brink of turning 40, right? And, most people, when they're of that age, are pretty established in their careers and aren't willing to take a pay cut. Well, I was, and it was a pretty substantial pay cut. I was making about a third of what I had been making in the corporate world. But I was willing to do that because I thought, this is my lucky break. And it was.
So you start the morning show, and then that eventually transitions to where you are now?
Well, interestingly enough, the guy that ended up hiring me for the morning show left, and he was on the board of the Associated Press for the Chesapeake region. And nobody wanted to step up to that position, and I said that I would do it. It meant traveling to Washington, D.C. once every couple of months and sitting on the board. I was like, I'm doing it. And that was the best thing I ever did, because when I went there, I met program directors and news directors from Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And that then led to my second job in radio, which was working for a big news talk station in Washington. It was owned by ABC at the time, and I worked for WMAL in Washington, D.C. So that whole situation at WDEL was just really fortuitous for me in the things that happened that got me to the point where I am today.
So how long were you in Washington?
I was there for a year, but I had this urge to come back to Philadelphia, and so I did, and started working for KYW, and then that led to a job at the Big Talker 1210. They were both owned by CBS in the Philadelphia market.
So
I wanted to come back to my hometown.
right. Well, that's the ultimate goal usually.
Right.
So you end up at 1210, and
Yeah.
where does it go from there?
Well, so I was at 1210, and that was really a good learning ground for me, because I knew, after having worked at KYW and doing news, that I really liked the idea of being a talk show host. But I'd like to point out that there aren't very many female talk show hosts in the whole country. So I worked with people like Michael Smerconish, who has gone on to be on satellite radio, and he also has a show on CNN. But at the time, he was the main talk show host in Philadelphia. I also worked with Don Giordano, learned a lot from them. And my program director gave me the opportunity. She gave me a talk show on the weekends, because that's kind of the learning ground. That's where you learn how to do it. So I had a talk show on the weekends, and then whenever they needed a fill-in the afternoon drive, she would allow me to do that. So I was getting experience there. But then what happened in 2008 was the radio industry took a hit, as it did a lot of businesses, because of the recession, and CBS laid off a lot of people all across the country, and my position was eliminated. So that was in 2008.
Okay. So then how do you end up where you are now?
Well, actually a friend of mine informed me that there was a talk radio station, a brand new station opening up in Delaware. And it was owned by, ironically, the company where I got my first full-time job, and that was WDEL, Delmarva Broadcasting. And so I called the general manager, and they interviewed me for a news director's position. And I was interested in that, but when they listened to my audio from the Big Talker, they thought that I would be better as a talk show host. And I was never so happy that they thought that, because really, in my heart of hearts, that's exactly what I wanted to be.
Well, you could have easily given up at that point. I mean, that's a testament to you that, you continue to stay patient and, plow away at it. That could be very discouraging and disheartening. But now, how long have you been your current station? And tell me about, I mean, you have several. I'd rather have you tell me about them than me read through them. Tell me about some of your accomplishments, since you've been there.
Well, since it was a brand new station, listeners didn't know who I was. And honestly, in talk radio, you have to build a relationship with people. I wasn't a brand name in the community. The two other hosts that were hired from a competing station. And so they were able to bring listeners to the station. I alone was not able to do that. So I started in 2012, and we just got our numbers, our ratings for the fall book 2014, and my numbers have quadrupled since I started. So wow. I really feel good about that.
Yes. Can you give me some of your awards and accomplishments that you've had?
Yes, yes. And so I submitted a couple of my audio segments. I won last year the Delaware Press Association for Best Interview. And then I also submitted to the Associated Press Chesapeake region, because that's the region the radio station that I work for is in. And I won Best Talk Show.
And you also, before, were awarded the Best One-Time News Program for Remember.
Oh, right. When I was in Philadelphia,
Yes.
I won a couple of AIR awards as well. Yes, thank you for reminding me that.
That was for the Remembering the Events of 9/11, the 2008 Philadelphia AIR Awards, and Best Newscaster in the 2006 Philadelphia AIR Awards.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
No problem. That's why we have you write it down, because I know there's a lot of stuff to remember. So you've come a long way since high school as far as that goes, and going back there to those high school years, any particular thing or lesson that you learned in high school that has really helped you out to get where you are now? Something maybe you could offer to a current student that might be watching.
Well, I guess I would say this. A lot of times in life, you know, your parents tell you what you should do. You know, you should do this to make money. You should become a doctor. You should become a lawyer. I really think that if I had had someone, maybe if I had turned to a guidance counselor perhaps, that maybe I would have been on this journey a little bit sooner. You know, I didn't get into it until later in life. And I guess I would say to students, take advantage of guidance counselors and take advantage of maybe career aptitude tests to find out really what it is that you want to do, and then pursue it.
Okay, well, it seems like we're focusing a lot on your work and your career. What do you like to do outside of work? What are some of your interests, hobbies? You know, what's your social life like?
Well, I really like to be outside, and I think that has a lot to do with growing up in the Mount Laurel, Medford area, because back in the 70s, it was very rural, and I just remember, you know, riding my bike all the time, and that's exactly what I do today. I'm really into bike riding, and I'm really into hiking, and I'm really into going to national parks. So in my spare time, that's what I spend a lot of time doing. And of course, I love reading.
And you also been to Ireland and Australia? You like to travel?
Oh, yeah, I'm a big traveler. I have relatives that live in Northern Ireland, and I've been there numerous times, 6 or 7 times. And yeah, Australia, was there for 5 weeks. But I think after 9/11, honestly, I've traveled mostly in the United States. And that's when I had this urge to really get into our own country and discover the beauty of this country. And that's when I got on this mission to go to all the national parks. And I just came back in October. I went to Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today and enlightening us on like your journey, your long journey to get to eventually what you wanted to do all along.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We've been speaking today with Lenape alum Susan Monday, a talk show host for Delaware 105.9 FM News Talk Radio. Thank you for joining us, and please join us again next time for more alumni interviews on Where Are They Now?